All right. Hi, everybody. My name's Evan Anders, and I am a postdoctoral fellow at the Sierra Institute at Northwestern University. I'm excited to participate in the Kavli Summer Program with you all and meet you all. And this is a hopefully short little presentation on some of the research problems that I've been thinking about over the past year or couple of years. I'm going to spend the first 5 minutes of the talk talking about this title slide topic, massive star variability, and then the second 5 minutes of the talk talking about some of the other fun projects I've done with Daedalus, which is the code that I use to do science. This movie on this title slide will come back in a few slides, so let's get going. So here is your Astro 101 HR diagram with luminosity on the y-axis and surface temperature on the x-axis. And when I say massive stars, I'm talking about blue main sequence and supergiant stars that occupy this circled area in the upper left corner of the HR diagram. These stars are important for many reasons. They have lots of evolutionary stages. They explode as supernova, which enrich the interstellar medium with all sorts of metals and also energy, and they leave behind remnants like neutron stars and black holes, which are interesting in themselves. So we care about massive stars. We care about the effects that they have on the galaxy and on the universe. And so we find it important to try to understand how they work. So when we talk about the insides of massive stars, these stars have convective cores at the center, so it's swirly and turbulent there. And then outside of that, they have stable radiative zones. And we'll come back to this in a couple of slides, but just keep in mind that's the structure of the stars that we're talking about. So Dominic Bowman and some other folks published a paper a couple years ago analyzing K2 light curves of massive stars, and they observed some low-frequency variability in these stars. So they have light curves like what you see here with magnitude versus time on the x-axis, and when they transform those into the frequency space, they get amplitude spectra that look like this. So here you're seeing amplitude versus frequency, and this frequency spectrum has basically one feature, a bump, and it's a low frequency red noise signal because it's a flat line that's above the noise floor. So yeah, when they look at these stars, they see red noise signals like this. This is not like a 1 in 10 stars have this or a 1 in 50 stars have this. This is a most stars have this signal sort of phenomenon. So they looked at 100-some stars in this sample. The stars they looked at are presented on this color magnitude diagram behind me. And basically all of the colored in symbols, which is almost all of the stars that they looked at, have this signal. I think of the stars they looked at, a handful, like 3 to 5, didn't have this low frequency signal. So since this is such a ubiquitous phenomena on massive stars, it's probably something that can tell us about the workings of massive stars. And the question that the field has is, what's causing this low frequency signal? Generally, people assume that the signal is caused by gravity waves driven by core convection. So you have this turbulent, swirly core convection, it hits the radiative zone and excites gravity waves, and those propagate to the surface, and we're observing them as this red noise. Now, this may be what's happening, but maybe it's not quite that simple. So I've put this vertical line here at 1 inverse day, and that vertical line on this plot corresponds to this vertical line on this plot. So this whole plot is kind of in that red noise range that we were seeing on the previous plot. And the black line that you're seeing on this plot is a stellar spectrum from one of the Bowman stars that we were looking at. So this is what the red noise looks like. It's a pretty flat black signal. Now the red and yellow lines on this plot here are some theoretical predictions of what the surface signal of gravity waves excited by core convection should be. So basically these lines take some excitation of convection near the core and then propagate that through using linear theory to get what the wave should look like at the surface, and you can see that that theoretical prediction does not match those observations. Specifically, there's these huge peaks in the theory, which are not present in the observations, and also there's a low frequency decline that the theory has, which is not present in the pretty flat observations. So the question that I'm trying to ask, and that a lot of other people in the field are trying to ask, is can we rule out the hypothesis that this is or is not a signal of waves driven by core convection? And so the way that I am trying to contribute to this problem is by making and analyzing these big three-dimensional spherical simulations of massive stars. So this movie that you're seeing here is a movie of a simulation I've made. It is a movie of about 95% of a massive star, where the background stellar profile is taken from a MESA stellar model. The colors you're seeing are entropy, so red is hot and buoyantly rises, and blue is cold and buoyantly falls. And you can see there's kind of three arcs that you can see that I've put on this equatorial cut on the top, and those correspond to the three orthographic projections at the bottom. So the small arc is in the middle of the core convection zone, where you see turbulent dynamics in the top panel, and this corresponds to the bottom left orthographic projection, where indeed you kind of see some convective dynamics. The middle arc is at the core radiative boundary, where you can see at the bottom middle waves being excited by convective motions. And then the big arc near the outer edge of the equatorial slice is near the surface, and there at the bottom right you can see the gravity waves that are happening close to the surface. And so basically that signal there is the signal that we're trying to measure in these simulations in order to try to better understand could those observations have been of gravity waves, or are they perhaps actually measuring something else? So that's one project I've been thinking about, and I am going to be thinking about a lot over the course of the summer. One of the other problems I've been thinking about over the past few months is the problem of convective overshoot, as it is generally called in the stellar community. Basically, the fundamental problem here is that if I put up some pictures of stars like this, where massive stars have convection zones at the center and radiative zones at the outside, or solar-like stars in the middle have radiative zones on the inside and convective zones on the outside, the problem is that the boundary between convection zones and radiative zones is fuzzier than this picture makes it look. We don't really exactly have a good theoretical picture for how far convective motions should extend into those stable radiative zones. And so I've been doing some simulations to try to help build this theoretical picture. So these simulations look quite a bit different from those massive star simulations I showed a couple of slides ago. These are now still in the same Daedalus code, but these are in Cartesian 3D domains, and what you're seeing is a vertical slice through one of those Cartesian domains. On the left, you're seeing the vertical velocity, and on the right, you're seeing temperature perturbations. I've annotated both of these plots with two horizontal lines. The dashed horizontal line is basically the Schwarzschild boundary of the convection zone. Yeah, and this is where like stellar structure code would put the boundary of the convection zone. But you can see that in the vertical velocity panel on the left, the big orange warm upflow extends past that dashed horizontal line to the solid black line, which is the measured boundary of the convection zone from the simulation. But then there's not really anything happening in the vertical velocity above that line. Now, if you look over at the temperature perturbations, the orange upflow on the left is a red hot upflow in the bottom convection zone, but then above the dashed line, it actually flips its temperature perturbation sign, so it becomes a cold upflow in this convective overshoot region before it hits the solid horizontal line and then excites gravity waves in the stable region above that. So these dynamics here, this flipping from a hot upflow to a cold upflow, and the size of that overshoot region are kind of two things I'm trying to figure out in this project, and hopefully this paper will actually be coming out sometime during the Kavli program. So if you're interested in this, I can try to talk to you more about this pretty soon. And then the last thing that I've been thinking about over the past few years, and which I've proposed to work on with somebody at the Kavli program, is this question of entropy rain or thermals. So here's some observational context for this project. This is a velocity power spectrum of the surface of the sun versus spherical harmonic degree. And I've annotated it a bit so you can see there's kind of a bump in this power spectrum on the right side at the granular scale. So that's the scale of the convective motions at the sun's surface. There's also a bump at what's called the supergranular scale, which is the convective motions which occur a bit deeper in the sun. But there's no bump at any larger spatial scale than that. And so kind of a classical convective picture of there's big swirling cells happening at all depths throughout the convection zone seems to not be showing up in the data that we see from the sun. And so there's a lot of different ideas to try to explain why we don't see these giant cells. And one of the ideas is that there could be something called entropy rain happening, which is to say that instead of having big warm upflows, maybe we just have really intense cold downflows, because both of those things carry the same sort of flux. Warm stuff going up is the same as cold stuff going down. So we were a little skeptical of this idea, but we set out to try to see how a model of this entropy rain might behave. And here's some simulations I did of thermals, or basically blobs of cold fluid that I dropped, which then evolved into vortex rings and propagated downwards. The color that you're seeing here is the entropy perturbations, so it's basically how cold the fluid is, and you can see that it kind of isolates itself into two spots. That's because this is actually a three-dimensional ring, and we're seeing a vertical slice through it. The thing that I studied a couple years ago was how the density stratification of the sun's atmosphere and interior would affect these propagating vortex rings, which maybe is what this entropy rain looks like. And so on the left, you can see what one of these things looks like in an unstratified atmosphere. So this is basically how a vortex ring would evolve if you took a cold blob of fluid and you dropped it from the ceiling in your room and you watched it fall to the floor. It would actually grow and slow down like the one on the left. But in the sun, where it's much denser at the bottom of the convective envelope than the top, if you drop a cold blob, it actually compresses as it goes into more dense regions, and it accelerates and gets faster. And it turns out that if you had a bunch of these little tiny raindrops, they could actually be pretty effective for carrying the solar flux. Now, we've left out a lot of the complications that are happening in the solar convection zone in this project, and there's all sorts of possible future questions that can be asked here. But the first question, which is one that I think could be asked during the timeline of the Copley program, and which I'm excited to work on with one or some of you, is the question of how does hydrogen ionization change this picture? So at the top of the convection zone, hydrogen is not fully ionized. At the bottom of the convection zone, it is. This ionization project changes the buoyant signature of these downflows, which could totally change the way that they propagate, and could either be the doom of this entropy rain picture or could make it even more plausible. I don't know. So I'm excited to think about this and work on it some with one of you. The last thing I do want to say is that Daedalus, as I've mentioned, is the code that I use. It's a flexible framework that lets you solve arbitrary partial differential equations using spectral methods. It works in Cartesian geometries, and it's starting to work in spherical, like I showed, and cylindrical geometries. It's really powerful, and it lets you do really diverse experiments. So by working with me on this project, you will get to learn how to use Daedalus, and hopefully you can put it to use going forward after the Copley program in your own research if you want. So thank you for your attention. In summary, I study some fundamental problems in stellar fluid dynamics. I use Daedalus to do that, and I mostly focus on convection. Sometimes that means large scales, like full star simulations. Sometimes that means small scales, like at the convective boundary. Or sometimes it means really small scales, like entropy rain, where it's individual convective flows. So thanks. I look forward to meeting all of you. And if you want to chat with me, please send me an email or take a look at my website if you want to see some of my papers or other work.